Thank you for those kind words. I appreciate it. On November 11th, 1918, 100 years ago this month, what was known as the Great War, or the woefully misnamed War to End All Wars, came to a close. The political and geographic landscape of Europe, indeed the entire world, was radically changed. The war would also sow the seeds of what would become an even greater conflict just 21 years later. Despite the war's significance and impact, it's widely regarded as ancient history today and receives little attention compared to some other wars such as World War II, the Civil War, or even Vietnam. For those of us who grew up in the 1960s, the Civil War was 100 years in the past. To put things in perspective, for young people growing up today, the First World War is just as distant. For those of us who remember the 60s, World War II had concluded just 20 or 25 years previously. For today's generation, Vietnam ended almost 45 years ago. I don't know about you, but that makes me feel old. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. By mid-1914, most of Europe became involved in the war for a variety of reasons, including interlocking treaties, nationalism, and imperialism. In the opening months of the war, 18th century tactics of mass frontal assaults went up against the 20th century technology of water-cooled, belt-fed machine guns and long-range artillery. The results were predictable and gruesome. The casualties were horrendous. Just citing 5 battles from 1914 to 1916 before we entered the war, there were well over 4 million casualties. As you can see, in the Battle of Somme alone, there were well over 1 million casualties, with 60,000 in the first day of fighting. Many more would follow. The war eventually devolved into trench warfare, with both sides trading casualties in largely fruitless and futile assaults on enemy trench positions. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll try to talk a little bit. Naturally, the American public was horrified to read about these statistics, and the United States maintained a state of neutrality. During the 1916 election, President Woodrow Wilson ran on a platform that he would not send American boys to die in France. His campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." However, due to a series of events, including Germany's decision to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare on American commercial shipping and a proposal to encourage Mexico to join with Germany in an alliance against the United States, Wilson asked Congress in 1918 to declare war on Germany and its allies to make, quote, the world safe for democracy, unquote. The United States was at war. However, declaring war was one thing, but being ready for it was something entirely different. Except for the short-lived Spanish-American War of 1898 against a weak opponent, the United States had not fought a war on foreign soil. Draftees and enlistees began to flood the Army training camps across the country, and the War Department soon discovered how totally unprepared the country was to fight an experienced and battle-hardened enemy overseas. The nation lacked virtually everything, including uniforms, grenades, artillery, and aircraft, just to name a few. Our French and British allies wanted the fresh and hardy American troops as replacements for their own depleted ranks to serve under French and British officers. However, the American commander, General John Pershing, insisted that the Americans would fight under American officers even if it meant a delay in getting our boys trained and ready to go into combat. Our allies put tremendous pressure on Pershing for the American government to override him, but he stood firm. Americans were going to fight in American units under American command, and were not going to be fed piecemeal into the decimated French and British ranks. While this presentation will concentrate on the infantry weapons of the war, in the interest of time, some of the weapons such as heavy machine guns, mortars, and grenades will not be profiled. However, if you have any questions about these, we can discuss them in the later Q&A period. Perhaps surprisingly, one of the items that was totally lacking in our arsenal at the start of America's involvement in the war was a combat knife. American fighting men had carried various types of knives in all prior conflicts, but these were generally privately procured items. The United States had never developed or adopted a knife specifically designed for combat use. Soon after the declaration of war, the Ordnance Department adopted a knife that was a little more than a long and thin blade with a triangular profile attached to a wooden handle with a metal knuckle boat. Referred to as a trench knife, it was adopted as a model 1917, and a version with a different configuration knuckle bow was designated as a model 1918. Both were carried in green leather scabbards with cartridge belt hooks. The advantage of the design was it could easily penetrate the heavy overcoats worn by the enemy. Otherwise, since it could only be used in the thrusting mode, it had little utility outside the combat. It could do a incredible job of punching a hole in a beer can, but that was about the extent of its non-combat uses. Regardless, these knives were issued to fairly large numbers of our doughboys during the war. These are two World War I pictures. The picture on the left is our doughboys shooting the 1903 rifles, and there's a 1917 trench knife. And these two doughboys, soldiers, have 1917 trench knives on the belts. A much better design was subsequently developed and adopted as a model of 1918 Mark I. It consisted of a more traditional double-edged blade affixed to a sturdy cast brass knuckle handle with projections on the finger loops and a skull crusher pommel. The knife was carried in a sheet metal scabbard. The Mark I was put into production by several American firms, but the war ended before it made it into the hands of our troops overseas. The Ordnance Department contracted with a French maker to produce a version of the Mark I in France, and it differed only in some cosmetic features. At the top is a French-made Mark I, and the bottom is American-made version. On the left is markings on the handle of the American-made version. Elephant C is Landers, Furrier, and Clark, the contractor that made them in America for 1918. And this is a French-made, which just has US in the date. The French blades were also marked Allion for the lion, which was the maker's logo. While details are unconfirmed, it's possible some of the French-made Mark I knives made it into the hands of the doughboys before the end of the war. A total of 139,000 Mark I knives were made, and after the war, most were placed in storage. A few of the 1917 trench knives were retained by the government. Most were sold as surplus in the 1920s. Here's an ad from a 1928 American rifleman. As you can see, they sold for $1 and for $1.50 with a scabbard. I wish we could find those at those prices now. As you know, no New York state orders. Go figure. One of the bright spots in Uncle Sam's arsenal at the time of the declaration of war was a model 1911 pistol chambered for the potent .45 ACP cartridge. Invented by the legendary John Moses Browning, the model 1911 was arguably the best military service pistol at the time, and some people, me included, think it still is. The only problem with the 1911, at the start of the war, there weren't enough of them. The Army only had about 75,000 model 1911 pistols on hand, including some 25,000 that had been made at Springfield Armory. Colt immediately geared up to produce more of the pistols, and contracts were given to other commercial firms to make the gun, but it would take a long time for those firms to get up and running. Springfield Armory was too burdened making .03 rifles to go back to making 1911 pistols. Other than Colt, the only company to produce any substantive numbers of 1911 pistols in World War I was the Remington Union Metallic Cartridge Company. By the end of the war, Colt had produced almost 644,000 model 1911 pistols as compared to just over 21,000 made by Remington UMC. The model 1911 was used by all branches of our armed forces during the war. These are the typical manufacturer marks of 3 guns. This was Colt, Springfield Armory, and Remington UMC. In order to fill the gap until Colt could ramp up its 1911 production line, the Ordnance Department decided to procure large frame revolvers made by both Colt and Smith & Wesson to be chambered for the same .45 ACP cartridge as a 1911 pistol. At the top is the Colt model 1917, and the bottom is the Smith & Wesson version. As you can see, they are very similar. To the right is the typical markings on the butt of the pistols of the revolvers showing the U.S. Army model 1917. However, since the .45 ACP cartridge was rimless, it would not be possible to eject the fired cases in the normal manner. ingenious half-moon sheet metal clip was adopted to hold the 45 ACP cartridges in place so they could be quickly loaded and easily ejected when fired. The modified Colt Smith & Wesson revolvers were adopted as a model in 1917. Significant numbers soon began to flow from the two factories since the machinery and workmen to make them were already in place. They were issued alongside the Model 1911 pistols. Between the increased Model 1911 production and the utilization of the Model 1917 revolvers, there were sufficient numbers of handguns on hand to arm the American troops departing for France in 1917 and 1918. The Model 1911 proved to be a superb combat weapon and was extremely popular with most of its users. The Model 1917 revolvers, while not as desirable to most soldiers as the Model 1911, was still a very serviceable and usable weapon. Now, these are two World War I photos. American troops on the left are at the practice range with the 1911 pistols, and the soldiers on the right, actually they're being reviewed by General Pershing, are all armed with the 1917 revolvers. Of course, the most basic weapon for the infantryman was the rifle. America was again fortunate to have its standard service rifle, the Springfield 1903. Based heavily on the excellent German Mauser, the Model 1903, commonly known as the Springfield or just the 03, was adopted in 1903 and was manufactured at the government facilities of Springfield Armory and Rock Island Arsenal. By 1913, the relatively small American armed forces were sufficiently equipped with 03 rifles. Rock Island ceased manufacture while Springfield drastically scaled back its production line. However, when America entered the war, it was obvious that the number of 03s on hand was woefully inadequate to equip the rapidly expanding Army. Springfield Army immediately increased production of the rifle, and Rock Island restarted its 03 assembly line. The 03s already in inventory were issued to our troops departing for France. This is one of the first contingents of American troops in France in 1917. As you can see, they're promptly armed with their 1903 rifles. It was obvious that many more rifles would be needed in a hurry, and the increased production at Springfield and Rock Island would be insufficient to prevent a crippling shortage of rifles in the near future. The Ordnance Department had two possibilities to address the impending crisis. One, give contracts to commercial firms to produce the 03, or two, adopt another type of rifle to be used alongside the 03. It was quickly realized that the lag time required to find suitable civilian firms, acquire the necessary production machinery, and recruit and train workmen would make production of the 03 impossible to solve the impending crisis. By default, Ordnance had to go with the second option of finding another type of rifle. Fortunately, the fates of war smiled on the United States at this critical time. Three American firms, Winchester, Remington, and Eddystone, and Fielder Remington, were just completing production contracts for the British government for the 303 pattern 1914 rifle. The workforces and machinery to manufacture the gun were still largely intact. It was a relatively simple matter to modify the pattern 1914 rifle to chamber the standard 30-06 cartridge. Otherwise, it was essentially the same as the British pattern 1914. The modified American rifle was adopted as a model in 1917. After working out some early production glitches, large numbers of the rifles were coming off the three assembly lines and delivered to our troops in training camps for those departing to France. So the top is the 1917 rifle, and these three photos at the bottom are the typical receiver markings of the manufacturers, Winchester, Remington, and Eddystone. The model 1917 was heavier and bulkier than Trim 03, but possessed an excellent receiver-mounted rear sight and proved to be a reliable and effective weapon. By the time of the armistice in November of 1918, about 3/4 of the troops of the American Expeditionary Force in France were armed with 1917 rifles. The United States was most fortunate that this additional source of rifles was available at such a critical junction. The Model 1903 and Model 1917 rifles both provided excellent service to our troops and saw very wide use during the war. These are three photos of American soldiers with 1917 rifles. I particularly like the one at the left. This mud-encrusted doughboy looks very weary, and he's covered with mud, but he still had the reliable 1917 rifle. This next shot are American troops with the 03. As you can see, they're marching at the top and firing from improvised trench positions. These are the Marines with 03 and Lewis guns on wheeled carts. And I think this is a particularly poignant photo. This is a worried, forlorn doughboy with his model 1903 rifle and sitting in a trench. I think we forget the horror that these guys went through. And I think this picture somewhat sums it up. One feature of trench warfare that was unfamiliar to American military planners were the assaults across no man's land to attack enemy trench positions. Early in the war, it was believed an automatic rifle capable of being carried and operated by one man could be a valuable tool in providing suppressing fire against enemy trenches while moving forward to attack. The French developed the first true automatic rifle, the model 1915, typically called a Chauchat after its inventor. The weapon, chambered for the French 7mm cartridge, weighed about 19 pounds and fired at a cyclical rate of about 300 rounds per minute. The Chauchat was intended to be used in the so-called walking fire mode, when it was fired from the hip while advancing forward. Frankly, a better description of this tactic would be the walking target mode. While issued to French troops in fairly large numbers, the Chauchat had one problem. It didn't work very well. When exposed to mud and dirt, pretty common in the trenches, it had a serious tendency to malfunction and garnered a very negative reputation for reliability. Nevertheless, it was the only automatic rifle available, and the United States acquired rather large numbers from the French for issue to our doughboys as they arrived in France. These are American troops, as you can see, they're firing a Chauchat rifle from a trench position. Clearly, a better automatic rifle was needed, and the American genius John Browning once again came through. Before we get to that, when we were filming some episodes for the American Rifleman television program, Weapons of the First World War, one of them that we filmed was a Chauchat. And this is a brief video of me firing a Chauchat for the program. And the first few rounds are going to be in a real time, and they as you see, it really was a whole lot of fun to shoot. And we fired probably 8 or 10 magazines through it, and it didn't falter one time, but that's because we were able to keep it clean and well oiled. That wasn't always possible in the trenches. And one glaring flaw with it, if you'll see the magazine here, it's open. And I guess the French wanted to know how many cartridges were left. I think it's a little more important to make the gun work. But anyway, it is what it is, as they say. John Browning developed what proved to be the best automatic rifle of the era. Adopted as the Browning automatic rifle model of 1918, Browning's gun was superbly designed and crafted. It had a quality blue finish, walnut stock, and checkered forend. It weighed about 16 pounds and fired the same powerful 30-06 cartridge as used with the model 1903 and 1917 rifles, both semi-automatically and fully automatic at a rate of about 550 rounds per minute from a 20-round detachable box magazine. Model 1918 BARs were made in World War I by Winchester, Colt, and Marlin Rockwell. These are the opposite top is the model 1918 BAR, and the bottom are the receiver markings, Winchester, Marlin Rockwell, and Colt. Unfortunately, the BAR didn't make it to the front lines in France until the closing weeks of the war, but even in that brief period, it proved to be a remarkable weapon. It was light years ahead of the French Chauchat, and it's too bad the BAR couldn't have seen more use during the war. It was initially planned for the BAR to be used in the same walking fire mode as the French Chauchat. However, once on the battlefield, our boys exercised better sense and generally fired their BARs without trying to become walking targets. Here's several photos. Two on the left are the BAR they're training for the walking fire mode. As you can see, there's a metal cup that the buttstock fit into to enable it to be fired from the hip. If you'll notice, right here is the same type of belt. You can look at that later, but there is the metal cup for the buttstock. Here is Lieutenant Val Browning, John Browning's son, who went to France to demonstrate his father's weapon to the troops there. This is a very rare photograph of a 1918 BAR, an actual combat situation. Again, they're firing from a fortified defensive position. This is a BAR circle here. And I like this picture too, of the doughboy with the BAR over his shoulder. Here's the belt with the metal cup for the buttstock, which wasn't used. And he's got a 1917 trench knife on his left hip. One type of weapon that was developed and fielded during World War I was uniquely American. As our doughboys were preparing to depart to France, our military planners were determining what types of weapons would help give them an edge in the brutal trench warfare environment they would soon be facing. It was apparent that a weapon with close range stopping power and high hit probability would be ideal for trench raids and similar tasks. The most obvious candidate for such a weapon would be a 12-gauge repeating shotgun loaded with double-aught buckshot. The Winchester Model 1897 shotgun was selected to be America's new trench gun. In order to make it more suited for trench warfare, a metal ventilated handguard bayonet assembly was developed for the shotgun. The Model 1917 bayonet used with the Model 1917 rifle was selected for use with the new trench gun. In order to supplement the Winchester 1897, Remington developed their own trench gun design in the form of a modified Model 10 slide-action shotgun. Instead of the separate metal handguard bayonet adapter assembly, Remington developed a wooden handguard with a separate bayonet adapter for their Model 10. So the top is a Model 1897 with the 1917 bayonet attached. Below is a Model 10 Remington trench gun. So you see these would be the third and fourth guns down on the rack here. By mid-1918, the trench guns began to arrive in the trenches of France, where they soon proved to be very effective close-range weapons. In fact, the only weapon superior to the trench gun in stopping mass infantry charges was a water-cooled belt-fed machine gun. The trench guns were so effective, the Germans cried foul. They claimed that our use of the shotguns violated the Hague Decrees, which is a forerunner of the Geneva Convention, because it caused, quote, unnecessary suffering, unquote. The Germans threatened that any American captured with a trench gun in his possession would be executed. This seems absurd coming from an enemy who regularly employed poison gas and flamethrowers. The American government promptly replied through diplomatic channels that the United States could and would take, quote, necessary steps, unquote, to retaliate if even one doughboy was executed. Apparently the response had the desired effect, because there's no record of any American soldier being executed for having a trench gun in his possession. The only real problem encountered with the trench guns during the war was the fact that the paper case shells initially issued with the gun could become wet and swell and wouldn't feed into the magazine. To rectify this, all brass double-aught buckshot shells were issued later in the war. As the war progressed, the War Department received numerous requests from frontline units to send us more shotguns. To the top is a box of World War I brass shotgun shells, and they had a unique crimp style to the head there. This is a 1918 pouch that contained 32 shotgun shells with the shoulder pouch. You'll see that over here on the left is that same pouch. About 25,000 model 1897 trench guns were made during the war, along with about 3,500 Remington Model 10 trench guns. Despite its effectiveness, none of the other nations in World War I fielded a combat shotgun, which to me seems somewhat surprising. Maybe they thought that gentlemen didn't use such brutal weapons. Our guys were more concerned with winning the war than defending the sensibilities of our enemy. To the left is a article in the May 1917 issue of Scientific American magazine, which really the first introduction to the American public of a combat shotgun. It's styled the shotgun's debut as a military weapon. And to the right are soldiers training with 1897 trench guns. The final item that we'll discuss today was not used in combat, but is one of the most ingenious and interesting weapons of the time. While the 03 rifle and its 3.6 cartridge was a great weapon with excellent long-range accuracy and power, it was a manually operated bolt-action gun with a relatively slow rate of fire. The noted inventor John D. Pedersen came up with a very clever concept that would enable the 03 to fire a small 30 caliber cartridge semi-automatically, yet retain the ability to use a powerful 30-06 cartridge when necessary. Pedersen designed what he called an automatic bolt, which could be inserted into a very slightly modified 03 rifle when the standard bolt was removed. The mechanism was dubbed the Pedersen device. A 40-round magazine fed the small cartridges, very similar to a 32 pistol cartridge, into the device, and the fired shell casings were ejected through a port milled into the left side of the 03 receiver. The device could be easily removed and the standard bolt reinserted to permit use of the 30-06 round. The modified rifle was designated as a model 1903 Mark I, and the device itself was designated as a Mark I. There was an oval elongated slot milled to the left side of the receiver, and the only special parts were a slightly modified trigger, sear, and magazine cutoff. This is the so-called Pedersen device bolt here. This is the left side of an 03 Mark I rifle with the device and magazine fitted in place. This is a 30-06 cartridge and a 30 Pedersen cartridge. Which one do you think was more powerful? A sheet metal scabbard was issued to hold the Pedersen vise when it was not in use, and a canvas pouch was issued to hold the rifle bolt when it was removed from the gun. This is another view of a top view of the device and the rifle, and that's the magazine, which was offset to the right to allow the use of the sight, so that if it was straight up, it would block the sight, so it's angled to the right. That's a typical receiver marking. It's a 1903 Mark I rifle, and here's the left side with the elongated port for the fired shells to be ejected through. The idea was that our troops in the trenches could fire their Springfield 03 rifles at enemy positions several hundred yards away prior to an assault. Once the advance was to begin, the standard bolt was removed, the Pedersen device inserted, and the 40-round magazine snapped into place. Thus, the idea was that the troops could then move forward for the enemy trenches while rapidly firing the small 30 caliber bullets to keep the enemy's head down during the assault. This was a holdover from the walking fire tactic, but it was envisioned that the large number of devices would overwhelm the enemy. The relative inaccuracy and lack of power weren't seen as problems, as the idea was to smother the enemy trenches in a hail of bullets. Remington was given a contract to make 100,000 Mark I Pedersen devices, and a similar device was also planned for the 1917 rifle. The idea was to withhold issuance of the devices until the grand offensive planned for the spring of 1919, when they would be used to surprise the Germans. The project had top secret status. Remington made about 65,000 Pedersen devices by the time the armistice when production was canceled. Plans to make the device for the 1917 rifle were also abandoned. The Army had its Pedersen devices but didn't know what to do with them in the post-war period. While the concept may have sounded good on paper, it almost certainly wouldn't have worked out very well in combat. A soldier under fire, when trying to remove the bolt from a Springfield and insert the device, could easily drop the bolt, the device, or both in the mud and lose them. Also, the concept of trench warfare and the outmoded walking fire tactics had understandably fallen from disfavor by this time, and there was no perceived need for a weapon designed for such use. The Army kept their Pedersen devices in storage until the early 1930s, when they were ordered to be destroyed as they weren't deemed worth the expense of continued storage. The devices and metal scabbards were thrown into bonfires, and the resulting metal slag was sold as scrap. Mark 103 rifles had their special parts removed and refitted with standard parts and reissued as standard service rifles. Some soldiers who had never heard of a Pedersen device and were subsequently issued these rifles in the 1930s and 40s likely wondered what the hole in the left side of the receiver was all about. Only a handful of devices survived the destruction order, and their value collectibles today. Now, when we were filming the American Rifleman show, the NRA wanted me to fire my Pedersen device on camera, and I told them the problem with that, I've got almost 1,000 rounds of original ammo, but it's 100 years old, and the primer and the powder probably wasn't in very good shape. So what we did, we had about 200 rounds loaded to the original specifications. So then we decided it'd be fine to go ahead and fire it on camera. This is a still picture of It's a still picture of me when we did the first test fire. When it came time to do the video, a young lady on the film crew, she really wanted to do the fire. So we said, sure, why not? So this is a video of the parachute device being fired, and frankly, this is probably one of the few times in the last 100 years that a parachute device has actually been fired. She fired at one time with 30.6 cartridge in normal manner. I'm going to take out the bolt, put it in the pouch, take the device from the metal scabbard, and lock it in place, cut the magazine cut off now. .40-round magazine. Chamber rounds. Ready to go. Now, if you wonder why it's smoking like it is, we oil it very heavily, and so that's the oil burning off, which is fine, it's normal. That's a great shot on the left side of the shell coming out of the port. And for a 100-year-old mechanism, it works pretty well. Kept wanting to fire it, but when it ran out of the 40 rounds, we had to take it away from him. This is a slow motion. Great shot of the cartridge coming out of the port. That's a group, that's about 35 or 40 yards. It's really not a bad grouping. It's nothing short of amazing that the United States entered the First World War having to start almost from scratch. And in the course of a year and a half, ended the conflict as the best armed and most effective fighting force in the world. The end of the war and the subsequent decades of the 1920s and 30s was a time of relative peace for the United States. The armed forces were reduced to a fraction of the 1918 period, and there was ample supply of weapons left over from the First World War to meet any expected need. However, sadly, the war to end all wars did not live up to its name. And just 21 years later, the world was again at war. Like before, the United States wanted to stay out of the conflict overseas, but things changed on December the 7th, 1941. Once again, our armed forces were not ready to fight a seasoned and determined enemy overseas, and there was a troubling shortage of weapons. The weapons left over from the First World War were dusted off and issued to a rapidly expanding military until newly made weapons could be produced. Eventually, the industrial might of the United States was able to provide our fighting men with excellent weapons for use in the war. For the first couple of years, however, the weapons left over from World War I proved to be extremely valuable to the war effort. With the obvious exception of the Pedersen device, all the weapons we've discussed saw active use by our armed forces during World War II. Now this is a Marine on Saipan late in the war, and he has a 1917 trench knife. There's a closer view inset on his belt. These are American soldiers, one in Europe and one in the Pacific with the 1918 Mark I trench knives that were made in World War I. This is a soldier with a 1911 pistol in Europe, and this is a Marine with a 1917 revolver on Iwo Jima, I believe. And see put to good use. These are American MPs in Europe guarding German prisoners. This is a Marine Raider unit in the Pacific, and they're primarily armed with O3s. These are 1917 rifles that were recycled for use in World War I. As you can see, these are two soldiers each armed with a 1917 rifle. And then the BAR. This is a early 1942 version of a Marine Raider in training. He has a totally unmodified World War I production BAR. And this is a photo of the improved, quote unquote, model 1918 A2 World War I BAR that was fitted with a bipod, folding butt plate, magazine guides, and various so-called improvements that actually added about 4 or 5 pounds to the weight. And once in combat, a lot of the BAR guys removed the BARs and everything they could to put it back in the same configuration that John Brown invented it in the first place. And finally, these are 2 Marines on Okinawa. One on the left has a M1 rifle. One on the right has a 1897 trench shotgun. Now, while the 97 trench shotgun was put back into production during World War II, this is a World War I version. The various weapons we've discussed this afternoon may be relics of a time long past. However, they were made of the finest materials and exhibited superb craftsmanship. They were designed to last several lifetimes as compared to the almost disposable weapons made today. They may be obsolete as frontline arms, but they were indispensable tools in the hands of our fighting men who battled the foes of freedom twice in the first half of the 20th century. As far as I'm concerned, that's a pretty good legacy. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Bruce. If you happen to have one of his books, he'd be happy to sign it for you. If you have any questions for Bruce, feel free to come up and ask him those questions. You're going to hang out for a little bit?
I sure will. Yep.
All right. Thanks again, Bruce. Great job. Great job.